If you were harmed by Carl Redfield Jr.'s unspeakable acts, we will stand with you to keep you safe and get you the justice you deserve. You are not alone.
When detectives pressed play on that video, the entire room went silent. What they saw wasn't just evidence. It was horror, recorded frame by frame. You could see the disbelief on their faces. These were trained officers, men and women who had seen things most people couldn't imagine. But this was different. On screen, the man looked calm, clean shirt, polite smile. But in those videos, he was something else entirely. They thought they knew him. He sold them cars. He greeted them at the gas station. He waved at kids from his driveway. He lived among them for years, laughed with them, and filmed the unspeakable. In that moment, the line between ordinary and evil disappeared. It wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. It was someone they trusted. And now, the world would know his name. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story you're about to hear will make you question how well you really know the people around you. And if you don't, maybe ask yourself why stories like this keep getting buried until it's too late. Framin, boy in Harris County, Texas. Carl Redfield Jr. wasn't a name anyone feared. He sold cars at a local dealership off Highway 6. Most days, you'd find him wiping dust off windshields, shaking hands with customers, cracking jokes about gas prices. To his neighbors, he was helpful, polite, the kind of man who'd mow an old lady's lawn or help lift a heavy couch on a hot day. He smiled at customers, helped neighbors move furniture, even gave car advice to single moms just trying to make it through the week. And every time someone thanked him, he'd grin, like a man proud of his reputation, proud of the trust he'd earned. But what no one knew was that behind that warm handshake, he was already living a double life. It's strange how easy it is to hide darkness in plain sight. Sometimes all it takes is a smile, and people stop asking questions. Witness. He was always friendly. You'd never think he could hurt anyone. But there was something about Redfield that no one could see, until investigators did. If you think evil always looks like a monster, you're wrong. Hit subscribe, because stories like this are the only way to stay aware. And if you won't, at least drop a comment and tell us why ignorance feels safer. It started quietly, a single report, tucked away in a file that barely filled 2 pages. Then came another, different name, different neighborhood, same story. And by the 3rd one, detectives realized this wasn't a coincidence. Something darker was hiding beneath the calm surface of Harris County. 3 women, different ages, different lives, but the same. Terror, the same method, the same man. One of them said he was charming. Another said he seemed like a gentleman, the kind of man you'd trust if your car broke down at night. He offered help, a ride home, safety. But behind that easy smile, there was calculation. He wasn't offering kindness. He was selecting victims. They were picked for their silence. Women living alone. Women who wouldn't be believed. Women who would rather forget than relive. When the detectives pinned the photos on the board, something unsettling happened. Each face seemed to echo the same question. How many more? Maps covered in red circles, sticky notes with times and streets, and right in the center, a smiling ID photo from the car dealership. He looked harmless, a salesman, a neighbor, a friend, but every line drawn from those faces led straight back to him. Police traced the pattern across months, maybe years. Women who hadn't even reported, women who thought it was their fault, women who didn't have the strength to speak up. And still, while investigators pieced the story together, he was out there, smiling, shaking hands, closing deals. He was invisible, not because he hid, but because no one ever looked close enough. Sheriff, we believe there may be many more victims. If you recognize this man, please come forward. It wasn't just an arrest they were building, it was a revelation, a map of trust betrayed, of kindness twisted into control. And by the time detectives noticed the pattern, it was already too late. The evidence they needed was buried under years of normalcy. masked by that friendly voice, that perfect smile. In their own words, the lead investigator said, "It's not the monsters in the dark that scare you. It's the ones that wave good morning." And that's when they knew. They weren't hunting just a suspect. They were uncovering a system built on blindness. You're watching this safely from the comfort of your screen. They didn't get that chance. Subscribe, not for me, but for the victims who never got their voice back. Because when stories like this go unheard, predators stay invisible. And if you won't subscribe, then at least say why in the comments. Tell the world why silence feels safer to you, because that's exactly what he counted on. Detectives needed proof. Patterns weren't enough. The testimonies, the reports, the fear, all of it pointed in one direction, but without physical evidence. The case was still a shadow. They needed something that would speak louder than words, something that couldn't lie. And they got it on a Thursday afternoon that felt too quiet to matter. The heat hung over Harris County like a blanket. The air was heavy. Officers lined up outside an apartment that looked ordinary, too ordinary. It was a one-bedroom unit, sandwiched between two others, curtains drawn, a welcome mat that said, "Bless this home." They knocked once, twice. Then came the shout, "Sheriff's office! Search warrant!" What they walked into was not chaos. It was precision. Every item in its place. A perfectly folded blanket, a spotless counter. The smell of air freshener mixed with something faint, something metallic. Redfield wasn't there. He'd already been picked up earlier that morning at the dealership. But his apartment, that was the real story waiting to be told. Detectives began the slow, methodical search. Every drawer, every shelf, every vent. They looked under rugs, inside picture frames, behind mirrors. And then one officer, Officer Martinez, reached a door that didn't belong, a small one, hidden behind a rack of shirts in the bedroom closet. The handle was stiff. When they forced it open, a cold draft hit the room. Inside was a small, unlit compartment, stacked floor to ceiling, with boxes. Not moving boxes, not clothes, but plastic storage bins, clear, labeled, sealed tight with tape. When they opened the first bin, it was full of USB drives, dozens, each marked with a date and a name. January 2018, March 2020, June 2022. It went on and on. They found hundreds of them, lined up like trophies, each one containing hours of recordings. But it wasn't just the number that horrified them. It was the order. Each drive labeled, categorized, and cross-referenced with a note, as if he was archiving his own crimes. Every file told a story, a room, a face, a night. It was methodical, almost professional, like someone running a business of cruelty. Forensic techs began transferring the data. They expected a handful of files. Instead, the drives flooded with video, hours, days, years of footage. Some were dated as far back as 2015. That meant for nearly a decade. This man had been recording, editing, storing, and re-watching the lives he'd broken. One detective would later say, "It was like walking into a museum built by a monster, every exhibit labeled, every piece cataloged. They found spreadsheets, notes in folders, even short clips, each one organized by location, parking lots, apartments, motels, back seats. And in every clip, one detail repeated, a laugh, a gesture, a look in the camera that didn't belong. He looked straight into the lens, calm, composed, proud. He wasn't hiding his face. He wasn't ashamed. He wanted to be remembered. In a small locked drawer beside his bed, officers found a notebook. Black cover, worn edges. Inside were hand-drawn diagrams, coded notes, and what looked like journal entries. One page read, "Control is everything." Another, "Keep them quiet. Keep them close." It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was insight into a mind that documented its darkness like art. Outside, the officers started carrying out the evidence. Box after box after box. Neighbors watched from their balconies, whispering his name in disbelief. The man they'd known for years, the man who waved at their kids and lent them tools, had turned his own apartment into a vault of human suffering. It took hours to clear the room, but no matter how much they packed, it felt endless. Each new box was another story, another secret. And when they were finally done, one detective sat on the steps outside and whispered, he didn't just keep memories, he kept control. They realized this man had built an empire of proof that he thought no one would ever see. But that day, it all came crashing down. And that's when investigators understood. They hadn't just found his evidence. They'd opened his mind. He'd been recording for years. He kept trophies. He kept files. He didn't just remember. He relived. Evil doesn't sleep. It documents itself. If that doesn't shake you, comment below and tell us why. Because when monsters start recording their crimes and smiling through them, the least we can do is refuse to look away. July 24th, a quiet afternoon, the kind that drifts by without warning. At a car dealership off West Road, business was moving as usual. Customers browsing, engines idling, laughter echoing across the lot. But for detectives watching from unmarked cars parked nearby, this wasn't another afternoon. This was the end of a hunt that had lasted for months. They waited, watched, timed every movement, and then he appeared. Dressed in that same pressed shirt, name tag shining under the sun, smile ready for the next sale. He didn't look like a man running from anything. He looked like someone who believed he couldn't be caught. Two detectives stepped out of their car and started walking toward him. The others followed from behind. The world slowed. Redfield turned, saw them coming, and for a brief second, he smiled. Not panic, not confusion. A smile, like he was greeting old friends. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He just smirked. They read him his rights, searched him on the spot, and took his phone. That phone would turn out to be the key that unlocked everything. Inside it, more evidence. Messages, screenshots, recordings, conversations with victims, instructions, and folders synced to cloud storage, backups for the drives hidden in his apartment. He wasn't just careful, he was confident. He believed his secrets were safe behind encryption and passwords. But the cloud keeps more than people realize. Detectives pulled everything: location tags, timestamps, even deleted backups. Each discovery painted a clearer picture. A man who lived two lives. By day, he sold cars. By night, he cataloged crimes. When they put him in the back seat of the police cruiser, he didn't say a word. He just stared out the window as the world he built, the illusion, started to crumble. He's calm in every frame of footage, calm when questioned, calm when photographed, like a man rehearsing for a role he'd been playing all his life. And in that moment, the detectives realized something chilling. You never really know someone until the police do. They took him away in cuffs, but even behind bars, his digital shadow remained, files in the cloud, copies on old hard drives, traces left in servers that could outlive him. His arrest made headlines that night. Neighbors watched the footage on TV, some crying, others shaking their heads. They'd trusted him. They'd invited him into their homes, shared meals, traded stories. For them, it wasn't just the man being arrested, it was the loss of safety, the realization that monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they hand you car keys, and as the cameras rolled, the last image they caught was that same smirk, the same face that once sold cars, now behind glass, staring straight into the lens. He's locked away now, but the damage, the trust, the fear, the memories, those remain. They ripple through victims' lives, through families, through a community that never saw it coming. He's behind bars, but the damage isn't. The fear isn't. The scars aren't. If you're watching this far, you're part of the few who care enough to listen. So subscribe now, not for me, but for every voice that still trembles when they remember his face. And if you won't, explain it in the comments. Tell the world why justice doesn't deserve your attention. And then they weren't numbers. They weren't case files. They were women with names, families, and plans for next week that never happened. When the investigation first began, detectives saw lines on paper, timestamps, case IDs, evidence tags. But as they read deeper, The lines turned into people, and each one carried a story that could stop your heart. One of them was a nursing student. She told police she couldn't stand to wear her scrubs again. They reminded her of how safe she thought the world used to be. Another was a mother of two. She said she couldn't drive at night anymore. The sound of tires on asphalt made her shake. One woman said, "I kept hearing his voice in my dreams." Another never left her house again. Some stopped answering their phones, some stopped smiling in photos, and some couldn't bring themselves to talk about it at all. For every woman who spoke up, there were others who didn't. They lived with the fear that their pain might not be believed, or worse, dismissed. Investigators shared parts of the recovered tapes with prosecutors, but not the public, not even the media. They said it was too disturbing, too graphic, too human. One detective admitted he couldn't sleep for 3 days after reviewing just one of the files. What started as a criminal case had become something more, a mirror, one that showed us everything we ignore every day. It showed how easy it is for people to doubt the broken, to turn their faces away from the uncomfortable truth, to pretend that monsters only live in stories. These women, they had trusted smiles, familiar faces, kind words, and that trust was used against them. That's what makes this story unbearable, not just the violence, but the betrayal. One woman told investigators, "I still keep my curtains closed. I don't want the world looking in, because I still see his face when I look out." She said, "He took my laughter, but not my truth." Those words, small, quiet, became the heart of the case. They reminded prosecutors that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about voice, about giving the broken a way to speak without fear of being forgotten. Some of the victims showed up at court hearings, even when they didn't have to. They said they just wanted to see him, to prove to themselves that he was real, that their nightmares had a face, and that face was finally behind glass. One woman walked out halfway through a hearing. She told a reporter, "I thought seeing him would make it better. It didn't." Another sat through every session, never cried, never blinked. She just whispered, over and over, "You can't erase me." The prosecutors called her bravery extraordinary, but she said it wasn't bravery, it was survival. "If I don't stand here," she said, "then he wins twice." That's the kind of strength you can't measure in evidence bags or courtroom transcripts. It's the kind that bleeds quietly and keeps breathing, no matter how heavy the memories get. Over time, the investigators realized that their job had changed. They weren't just chasing a criminal. They were holding space for broken souls trying to feel human again. They sent the tapes to the archives, sealed them under evidence law, and left notes warning others not to watch. Because no one should have to see what those women went through. And yet, every frame was a reminder that evil can look ordinary, polite, and patient. Behind every locked door in that apartment, behind every video file, there was a voice, trembling, quiet, asking to be remembered. And that's what this story became. Not a headline, not a statistic, but a promise that the voices he tried to silence would echo louder than his smirk ever did. For those women, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming something he never deserved, their dignity. And even though the world moved on, those voices still exist, not in fear, but in truth. What was once a criminal file became a mirror, and if you stare at it long enough, you start to wonder how many other faces we've walked past, pretending not to see. They weren't numbers. They weren't case files. They were women, with names, families, and plans for next week that never happened. When the investigation first began, detectives saw lines on paper, timestamps, case IDs, evidence tags. But as they read deeper, the lines turned into people, and each one carried a story that could stop your heart. One of them was a nursing student. She told police she couldn't stand to wear her scrubs again. They reminded her of how safe she thought the world used to be. Another was a mother of two. She said she couldn't drive at night anymore. The sound of tires on asphalt made her shake. One woman said, "I kept hearing his voice in my dreams." Another never left her house again. Some stopped answering their phones. Some stopped smiling in photos. And some couldn't bring themselves to talk about it at all. For every woman who spoke up, there were others who didn't. They lived with the fear that their pain might not be believed, or worse, dismissed. Investigators shared parts of the recovered tapes with prosecutors, but not the public, not even the media. They said it was too disturbing, too graphic, too human. One detective admitted he couldn't sleep for 3 days after reviewing just one of the files. What started as a criminal case had become something more, a mirror, one that showed us everything we ignore every day. It showed how easy it is for people to doubt the broken, to turn their faces away from the uncomfortable truth, to pretend that monsters only live in stories. These women, they had trusted smiles, familiar faces, kind words, and that trust was used against them. That's what makes this story unbearable, not just the violence, but the betrayal. One woman told investigators, "I still keep my curtains closed. I don't want the world looking in, because I still see his face when I look out." She said, "He took my laughter, but not my truth." Those words, small, quiet, became the heart of the case. They reminded prosecutors that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about voice, about giving the broken a way to speak without fear of being forgotten. Some of the victims showed up at court hearings, even when they didn't have to. They said they just wanted to see him, to prove to themselves that he was real, that their nightmares had a face, and that face was finally behind glass. One woman walked out halfway through a hearing. She told a reporter, "I thought seeing him would make it better. It didn't." Another sat through every session, never cried, never blinked. She just whispered, over and over, "You can't erase me." The prosecutors called her bravery extraordinary, but she said it wasn't bravery, it was survival. "If I don't stand here," she said, "then he wins twice." That's the kind of strength you can't measure in evidence bags or courtroom transcripts. It's the kind that bleeds quietly and keeps breathing, no matter how heavy the memories get. Over time, the investigators realized that their job had changed. They weren't just chasing a criminal, they were holding space for broken souls trying to feel human again. They sent the tapes to the archives, sealed them under evidence law, and left notes warning others not to watch. Because no one should have to see what those women went through. And yet, every frame was a reminder that evil can look ordinary, polite, and patient. Behind every locked door in that apartment, behind every video file, there was a voice, trembling, quiet, asking to be remembered. And that's what this story became. Not a headline, not a statistic, but a promise that the voices he tried to silence would echo louder than his smirk ever did. For those women, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming something he never deserved, their dignity. And even though the world moved on, those voices still exist. Not in fear, but in truth. What was once a criminal file became a mirror, and if you stare at it long enough, you start to wonder how many other faces we've walked past, pretending not to see. The courtroom smelled faintly of coffee, old wood, and tension. Every seat was filled. Reporters squeezed into corners, deputies stood by the doors, and in the middle of it all sat the man who had turned a quiet county into a story that would haunt it forever. Carl Redfield Jr. sat motionless, his orange jumpsuit pressed, his hair trimmed. If you didn't know the story, you might think he was just another defendant waiting for a routine hearing. But the silence around him said otherwise. It wasn't silence of respect. It was the silence of disbelief. Redfield appeared calm in court, no emotion, no apology. When the judge entered, every head turned, except his. He didn't rise with urgency, didn't glance at the crowd. He moved with the kind of stillness that makes you wonder whether remorse had ever been part of his vocabulary. The prosecutor read through the charges. Each one landed like a brick hitting concrete, deliberate, heavy, final. And through it all, he sat there, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing, no flinch, no tremor, just a man staring straight ahead as if he was watching someone else's life being read out loud. The survivors sat scattered throughout the courtroom, some with family, some alone. Every face was different, but the pain, the kind of pain that lingers behind the eyes, was the same. One woman gripped a necklace so tightly her knuckles turned white. Another couldn't stop shaking her leg under the bench. And in the back row, one sat completely still, her eyes locked on him, not out of fear, but to make sure he saw her strength. When the first survivor took the stand, the courtroom grew so quiet you could hear her inhale before she spoke. She said, "He made me believe I was safe." Then she stopped, looked at him, looked back at the jury, and continued, "But monsters don't need to hide under beds. They hide in plain sight." Every word she spoke was a piece of truth, being stitched back together. Every tremble was courage learning to stand. When she finished, she didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She walked back to her seat, head high, a quiet defiance that spoke louder than any verdict could. Then another woman spoke. She said, "I came here today not to forgive him, but to remind him. He didn't erase me." And for the first time, you could feel the weight shift in the room. Even the judge looked down for a moment longer than usual. It's strange how justice can feel both heavy and hollow at the same time. The victims found strength in their truth, but the truth couldn't give them back what they lost. When Redfield's attorney tried to speak, his voice trembled. He asked for leniency, but leniency doesn't exist for ghosts that still haunt the living. Redfield never apologized, never looked at the victims, not once. And as the verdict was read, he just blinked, as if it were an inconvenience, a line he'd already rehearsed. Some victims cried quietly into their hands. Others stood still, jaws set, refusing to let him see them break. For them, this wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming control. And outside that courtroom, the story was spreading, across phones, news tickers, television screens. The world was watching Harris County, not for the crime, but for the courage it took to face it. The sheriff addressed the public that evening, standing behind a podium lined with reporters. He said, "If you believe you're a victim, come forward. We're listening." It was more than a statement. It was a promise that no one else would be ignored. But even as he spoke, the faces in the crowd weren't just looking at him. They were looking at themselves. Because this story wasn't about one man anymore. It was about trust, about safety, about how easily both can be broken. It became a mirror for the community, forcing everyone to question how many other smiles they'd trusted, how many other warnings they'd missed. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people who believed in him, the ones who defended his name at first, the ones who said he'd never do that. It was about every quiet voice that was told to stay silent. In the end, Redfield's trial wasn't just a trial of a man. It was a trial of faith. Faith in appearances, faith in goodness, faith in the idea that monsters come with warnings. But the truth is, monsters rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they just blend in until one day the mask slips. The verdict didn't bring peace, but it brought clarity, and sometimes that's the only kind of justice the broken can ever get. The courtroom emptied one row at a time, reporters packing their gear, families holding each other, survivors standing in the same light that once terrified them. And for the first time, the county didn't just see a criminal, it saw the cost of not paying attention. He was a salesman by day, a predator by night. He smiled, he laughed, he blended in, and the scariest part, he wasn't a shadow hiding in an alley. He was daylight, walking among us. In the neighborhood where he lived, his porch light still burns every evening. People drive by, staring at the windows, trying to understand how something so monstrous could fit inside something so ordinary. He could be anyone, a coworker, a friendly neighbor, the man who holds the elevator door. That's what unsettled detectives the most. He didn't look like fear. He looked like familiarity. And as investigators continue to analyze those videos, one truth refuses to fade. Evil doesn't hide in darkness anymore. It hides in plain sight, right beside us, waiting for blindness to protect it. It hides behind smiles, handshakes, church pews, and bright office lights. It hides in the people we trust most, because we never think to look there. Redfield's story will live in court documents and news archives, but the impact, that lives in the quiet. in the way some women double lock their doors now, in the way parents look twice when someone new offers their child a ride home, in the way a whole community learned that danger doesn't always snarl. Sometimes it smiles. Every recovered video is another truth finally dragged into daylight. Every blurred name, every redacted face, a reminder that behind statistics are souls still trying to breathe. When you look at his mugshot now, that frozen half smile under fluorescent light, you realize monsters don't grow horns. They grow confidence. He was a salesman by profession, but what he truly sold was trust. And the buyers never knew the price until it was too late. The question isn't just who he was. The question is, how many more like him walk, unnoticed through our lives, hiding behind kindness, waiting behind normalcy? We live in a world where people scroll past pain like it's content. But behind every case like this, there are hearts still trembling, hands still afraid to reach for doorknobs. And if their stories fade, then all of this, every arrest, every trial, means nothing. Because silence protects monsters. So you have a choice. You can scroll away, pretend this was just another story, another headline that'll disappear by morning, or you can stand with the victims. You can keep their voices alive by refusing to let their pain be forgotten. Subscribe, because remembering is resistance. Because every time you share their story, you take power away from the silence that shelters predators. And if you won't subscribe, then step into the comments and tell the world why their pain isn't worth remembering.